All right, remember how we just traced parts of the nephron? Now there's another environment, and we're going to trace the bloodstream, right? So how are we going to do that? Well, I'm going to go back to this picture of this nephron that we saw before, and notice we have the renal artery. That's going to go through a bunch of blood vessels, right? It's going to go through tons of blood vessels. Oops. And eventually it's going to come out through the renal vein. How does that actually occur? How does this blood flow actually occur? Well, I'm going to zoom in, and we're going to come into this diagram over here. Right? So you actually have a few blood vessels. I don't want you to know all of them, right? But you actually have the renal artery. Then you're going to hit the arcuate artery, and then you're going to hit the interlobular artery, and eventually we're going to hit the afferent arterioles. Right, that's number one. Then you're going to hit what comes after arteries? Capillaries, right? There's actually a capillary here called the glomerular capillary. It's also called the glomerulus. And yes, capillaries also have a name, right? I know when you studied circulation, we didn't really go into naming conventions. We just always said arteries, capillaries, veins, right? This capillary has a name. It's called the glomerulus, right? And blood's gonna go right into the glomerulus, right? And we're going to talk about what happens afterwards, after we trace this first, right? So number one is the afferent arteriole. Number two is the glomerulus. Again, we're just tracing the blood flow. We're not tracing the nephron. Then comes the efferent arterioles. Eventually we have, this looks kind of weird, we have another capillary bed called the peritubular capillaries. And finally, we have the interlobular vein. And eventually, we're going to hit the renal vein. Now, here is something I want to tell you. Just to kind of be a little redundant about it. We said blood goes into the afferent arterioles. It's going to hit the capillary bed called the glomerulus. What was the function of capillaries? We learned in circulation that capillaries are blood vessels that exchange nutrients between the bloodstream and the tissue cells. In this case, it turns out that the glomerulus acts as a little filter. It's part of the bloodstream. So let's say you happen to be uric acid. You're small enough to go through this little filter net. So if you can fit right through, you're going to end up at the first part of the nephron. And the first part of the nephron is called the Bowman's capsule. Right over here. We drew it before. Remember, right over here? And you're going to go right in this environment. And if you don't get picked up back in the capillary bed, right, if you don't go back into the bloodstream, you will end up as urine. And you're probably thinking, well, I can end up back in the bloodstream? And I'm going to say, yes, you can. Let's look over here. We're going to look at it with like 4 or 5 different ways. I'm just going to erase this just to make it a little cleaner. Let's trace this flow. You're going to go through the bloodstream, your uric acid. You're going to go through the glomerulus right over here. and you're going to fit right in here, right? Uric acid, we don't want to reabsorb you. But let's say you happen to be glucose, right? Glucose will go through. Glucose is small enough to actually go through this glomerulus, right? Sometimes we filter out stuff that's also good. In this case, we filter out glucose. And we don't want to filter that out because glucose is good for us. So at the proximal convoluted tubule, the PCT, that's the site of reabsorption. What do I mean by reabsorption? Reabsorption means that I'm going from the kidneys, right? You see this nephron? And it's going to go back into the bloodstream. Again, there's always only two environments you can go into. You can go from and to. If you are not part of the nephron, just make sure you drill this in. You are going to be part of the bloodstream, right? You can only be in two places, right? If you stay in the nephron and you don't go back into the bloodstream, you will end up as potential piss, right? That's also called filtrate. There's a special name for that. That's called filtrate, potential piss, right? Anything that's riding in this tubule is called filtrate. There's a name for that. Now, I told you before that the PCT is the site of reabsorption. How does that stuff get reabsorbed back into the bloodstream? It's gotta enter via capillaries, because what did we say capillaries are? Capillaries are the blood vessels that exchange nutrients between the bloodstream and the tissue cells. Well, which capillaries do you think they are? Right? It can't be, let's go back to this diagram. It can't be the glomerulus, right? Because the flow can't backflow. So it's gotta enter back through the peritubular capillaries, right? And then it goes, this is glucose. And then glucose, let's say glucose comes right into the proximal convoluted tubule. It's gonna go right back into the peritubular caps. And it's gonna go out through the renal veins. Why is it called the peritubular caps? Well, let's look at this carefully. We have the glomerulus right over here. We have the efferent arterioles right over here. And we have this capillary bed. Yes, this is one big capillary. It happens to be that this capillary is around the kidney tubules. Right, so this is the kidney tubule, right? You see the kidney tubule? And you see that blood, you see the capillaries that are in red? That happens to be one big capillary that happens to be all around the kidney tubule. So we're going to call this the peri. Peri means around, tubular, capillary.